When an automaker decides to come out with a new subcompact crossover, there are generally two routes it can take. The first is the most popular. Take the mechanical parts from a car that's already in the lineup, design something new to stick on top of it, and call it a crossover. The second is to take a compact car as it is, lift the suspension and slap some body cladding on it, kind of like Subaru did when it turned the Impreza hatch into the Crosstrek. With this CX-30, Mazda's decided on a blend of both, with a design that looks an awful lot like the Mazda 3 Sport, but with enough differences between the two of them to help set them apart. One way you're not going to know the difference between the two is in what drives them. And aside from the fact that you can still get a manual transmission in the Mazda 3, everything else about them is identical mechanically, right up to and including the fact that you can get all-wheel drive in Mazda's hatchback. That means the base model of both of them gets power from a 2-liter, 4-cylinder engine that makes 155 horsepower and 150 pound-feet of torque. But GS and GT models, like the one I'm driving, use a 2.5-liter engine that's more powerful. There's also an even more powerful turbocharged version on the way that makes 250 horsepower and 320 pound-feet of torque running on premium gas, which is absolutely ridiculous and probably overkill for a lot of people out there. The naturally aspirated version of that engine is what's under the hood of this thing, and it makes 186 horsepower and 186 pound-feet of torque, which is more than enough, and it's really impressive considering it doesn't use a turbocharger, yet it sits pretty close to the top of the segment in terms of output. I think the only thing that comes close to this in a naturally aspirated form is the new trim of the Subaru Crosstrek that uses a larger engine than the rest of the models in that lineup. It's not quite as peaky as the turbo motor in something like the Hyundai Kona, and the big thing you're going to notice that's different between the two is just how smooth and linear this acceleration is. I know that probably doesn't lead the list of reasons why you'd buy a crossover like this in the first place, but it is nice to know that you've got passing power when you need it. So many crossovers like this just feel kind of anemic, but this thing has it nailed when it comes to power delivery. Silky smooth, lots of it when you need to tap into it, and there's a sport mode down here on the console if you need just a little bit more responsiveness. Whether you use that sport mode or not, the trade-off is that the CX-30 isn't the most efficient crossover of its kind. Mazda says the 2-liter should burn 8.6 liters per 100 kilometers combined with all-wheel drive, and the 2.5-liter is rated at 8.9 liters per 100. Now, that's not the worst on the market, and there are a few that burn more than 9 liters per 100 kilometers, but it's not all that great, especially considering how new this thing is. Now, this GT trim also has cylinder deactivation, so it should burn closer to that 8.6 liters per 100 kilometers, but in reality, you're probably going to do worse than that, and I've been doing worse than that this week, despite most of the kilometers I've racked up being on the highway. You know, that's not the only compromise you have to make with this thing either. The front half of this cabin is pretty roomy, but beyond that, it doesn't look so good. In fairness to the Mazda 3, it's got a lot of the same thing going on. It's not so roomy in the back, but up front it feels great. As you can see, I'm just at the limit of headroom in here with this sunroof, but in terms of cabin width, it's fantastic, and it feels like it's based more on a mid-size car than a compact one. Another testament to just how roomy it is up here is this massive console bin, as well as the fact that the cup holders are side by side. And I know that might seem like a small thing, but it is a pretty big deal, because most compact cars have their cup holders in line next to the gear shifter. But the fact that this is wide enough to have them side by side shows just how much room you have between you and the person sitting next to you. I do have one complaint about the cup holders though, and it is a bit of a weird one, but I do want to point it out nonetheless. And it's the fact that they're so far forward that they're kind of hidden underneath the dash. So when you go to put your coffee thermos in or take it out, you're going to whack it off of this ledge where the HVAC controls are. That is a bit of a strange oversight, but they are usable nonetheless. There are also pretty good sized door pockets so you can put a bottle of water in there as well. Now, the other thing is this is still a Mazda, so it does feel like this cabin was designed around the driver first and foremost. It just kind of envelops you and really puts you in control and command. And that is one thing I love about Mazda's products. It really feels like the same care and attention to driver's position that's put into something like the MX-5 is put into this CX-30 as well. And anyone who's driven a Mazda will know exactly what I'm talking about. You're going to start to notice some serious compromises in this thing as soon as you look behind the B-pillars. Now granted, these doors do open nice and wide, which is great if you have to load little ones into car seats or help with stuck buckles, but the space back here isn't exactly generous. And the same goes with these door openings. They're not all that wide, and I keep whacking my head off of the door frame when I get in and out of both the front and back seats. Now I can fit back here, but it's only barely, and it does feel pretty claustrophobic, and the story's the same when it comes to the trunk. Compared to just about anything else in this segment, it is a pretty compromised space, especially in terms of width. This is the first crossover like this in a long time that I haven't been able to fit our cargo testing pedal car in the back, and that is pretty disappointing, especially when you consider that it fits in the back of the smaller Nissan Kicks. I was expecting just a little bit more from this Mazda. Since I'm already on the subject of stuff I don't like, let's go ahead and talk about this infotainment system. And you know, I really do respect Mazda's approach to safety, but I really think it's missing the mark in the year 2020 when it comes to its aversion to touchscreens, especially considering it's willing to put them in some of its vehicles, but not all of them. And unfortunately, this CX-30 falls into that latter category. You've got this crisp and bright display up here on the dash, but unfortunately, the only way to run it is to use this controller down on the console, and it is dreadful. Now, if there was a bright side to systems like these, it's that once you get used to them, you can do most things without taking your eyes off the road, but that doesn't really make them any better. And I know there are a bunch of you waiting to jump into the comments and tell me how I don't know what I'm talking about, but I am here to tell you you're wrong. Because there's nothing about a system like this that's more intuitive than a simple tap on a screen, especially when you talk about systems like Apple CarPlay and Android Auto. That comes standard in this CX-30. Both of those were designed to be used with touch inputs, not with controllers like these, and it is very aggravating to use because everything takes such deliberate movements and controls. It's very annoying. If you want to zoom out on your Google Maps, you have to scroll around until you highlight the feature you want, then click on that, then click on the minimize button, and then tap that until it's wide enough, and then hit done. It's very annoying, especially when you're driving. You should be paying attention to the road, but considering how much attention it takes to use this, it's actually very distracting. It's just so dumb, and I can't imagine buying a vehicle that makes it so difficult to interact with something that you use every single day. Now, in fairness, Mazda's infotainment interface is just a little bit easier to use because it was designed around this controller, but it's still not all that great, especially when you look at the navigation system that's built in that looks like it was ripped out of MapQuest in the late 90s. To end all this infotainment talk on a bright note, I will say that it looks great with the overall design of this cabin. Especially in this GT trim with the black and brown leather you get, it looks fantastic. Now, you can order this thing with white leather, but I'm not that brave, and I'd be worried about how it would stand up to everyday use, especially if you wear jeans. You're gonna get some serious denim staining, but if that's your thing, you can order it that way too. And I will say that Mazda's been going after something of an untapped segment of the market between mainstream and premium brands lately, and this is a great representation of that because it looks and feels fantastic. Most of the materials in here are really good quality and they look and feel great. The same goes with the outside, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about the base GX trim or this GT version, it just looks great. And Mazda's designs in general are very nice and upscale these days, and it looks fantastic, especially with this Soul Crystal Red metallic paint job. That's only a $450 upgrade that I would say is well worth the money. And you know, at a glance, this thing really does look like a Mazda 3 hatchback with some body cladding on it, but there are some subtle differences a keen eye will notice. Take the shape of the back doors, they are quite different. They also don't have the quarter glass on them like they do with that Mazda 3, and they're on the body instead. So it breaks up that plain sheet metal that you get in the Mazda 3, which is my only complaint about that hatchback styling. Now that we're back on the subject of the Mazda 3, I will point out that they do drive pretty differently. There are some similarities between the two, but you can really tell that they're different vehicles aside from powertrain performance. Where the Mazda 3 is very dynamic and agile, this feels like a purpose-built soft-roader. It's a lot stiffer than the Mazda 3 or even the Mazda CX-5 that's a little bit bigger than this thing. Just the suspension and steering rack kind of crashes over broken pavement. It's not that it's uncomfortable, it's just very noticeable how rigid it is. It's crazy just how much of a difference this lifted suspension makes, but it's not sloppy or springy in any way, and again, it's just really stiff, but it is silky smooth over anything even close to perfect pavement, and it really does have the poise of a premium car. It's also got premium car quietness in this cabin, which is nice as well. And it is a Mazda and it's meant to be driven, so it is pretty agile and more agile than most crossovers like this. When you really get into it, it does feel pretty nice to drive. The steering is pretty much perfect, throttle and brake inputs are met really nicely and really quickly, and just in general, it's kind of fun to drive. You can definitely tell it's taller than the Mazda 3, but it's got the same kind of responsive and direct drive that I think a lot of people who even enjoy driving just a little bit are going to appreciate. When it comes to pricing, you're going to pay about $24.5 grand for the base version, and you do get some safety stuff, but it's limited to blind spot monitoring and rain sensing wipers. You also get heated front seats and Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, but that's really about it. Where you're going to start to get the bulk of the features you want is with the GS trim that's priced at just over $27,000 before freight and fees. And that's where you get stuff like adaptive cruise control and lane keep assist, but not all-wheel drive. To get that, you're going to have to add $1,500, and the same goes with the base GX model. But really, this GT trim delivers everything you want and then some. It's got all the same features as the GS, but it also adds some other stuff like this sunroof, as well as forward and reverse automatic emergency braking, and there's pedestrian detection up front. The only downside is the price, because you are going to pay about 34 grand before freight and fees. That is a lot of money for a subcompact crossover. It's not out of line with some entries, but when you consider the compromises with this thing, it does seem kind of expensive. And then when you look at it next to the Mazda 3, it is more expensive, and that really makes it a bit of a difficult decision to make if you're in the market for a new Mazda of this size. To recap, I like the CX-30 styling inside and out, the right amount of output from the 2.5-liter engine, and that it's actually enjoyable to drive. I don't like that it doesn't have a touchscreen, the limited amount of space in the back, and how expensive this top trim is. For everything I like about the Mazda CX-30, there's an awful lot I think I would struggle to live with. Even if you look past the way you have to interact with that infotainment system, it's not exactly practical and it can get pretty pricey. But then again, it's more stylish than anything else in the segment. It's got the perfect amount of power, and it's nicer to drive than any other crossover of its kind. So if any of those make your list of reasons to buy one of these things, I say take one out for a spin. But while you're at it, don't forget about the Mazda 3 Sport that delivers the same kind of space and style, all with a more dynamic drive, and it should save you a few bucks too.